Today, we're going to talk about a dragon you almost certainly haven't put in your game yet, and by the end of this, you absolutely will want to. Most of the dragons that dominate Dungeons & Dragons lore come from Western European tradition, the great winged, four-legged fire breathers that hoard gold under mountains and occasionally need a knight to throw at them. And those are fine, those are classics. But the world is considerably larger than Western Europe, and it turns out that other cultures have been imagining dragons for just as long, with results that are genuinely fascinatingly different. Today, we're going to talk about one of those, the Zilant, the steppe dragon of the Hordelands. And here's the thing I want you to understand from the start. You're not inventing this creature, you are restoring one. So settle back. Grab yourself a tasty beverage. It's time to get deeply nerdy, as this is the complete guide to the Zilant. The Zilant exists in the folklore of the Tatar, Bashkir, and broader Turkic and Volga peoples, preserved in legend and heraldry for centuries. It's the symbol of Kazan. It appears in the banners of old Khanats. It has a consistent, documented, specific body plan that artists and storytellers across the region have agreed on for a very long time, which is actually quite unusual for folkloric creatures. Most of these shift and blur depending on who's telling the story and where. The Zilant doesn't. It has a look, and that look is immediately distinctive, which is exactly why it works so well as a monster insertion into a fantasy setting like the Forgotten Realms. You're not making something up, you're drawing on genuine tradition that has its own internal logic, its own visual identity, and its own relationship to the cultures that created it. That gives it a weight that purely invented creatures often lack. In the Forgotten Realms, the Zilant fits most naturally into the Hordelands, the vast windswept steppe east of the Sunset Mountains, where the horse-lord clan peoples ride and the grass runs silver to the horizon. It's also found in the hill country bordering Rashomon and Murgome, where the steppe buckles upward into broken ridges and valleys. The witches of Rashomon know it. The dragon princes of Murgome fear it, though they would never admit as much, and the horse lords who bury their chieftains in the great earthen mounds of the steppe have a relationship with it that is older than anyone alive can remember. But before we get into any of that, we need to talk about what a Zilant actually looks like, because this is where most people go wrong, and getting it right is the whole point. The Zilant is not a standard dragon with a few details changed. Its body plan is genuinely different, and that body plan defines everything about how it hunts, how it moves, how it fights, and why it ends up living where it lives. The Zilant has 2 forelimbs and no hind legs, 2 powerful arms, powerful clawed, draconic in proportion, good for gripping and digging and shredding. Then below the waist, nothing at all. The lower body is a long, heavy, muscular, serpentine coil, like the tail of a great constrictor snake, flexible and powerful and built for 2 things above all else: moving through tight underground spaces and staying absolutely perfectly still in tall grass for as long as it takes. Picture the upper body of a dragon married to the lower half of a python, and you have the essential silhouette. Its wings are small, bat-like, and a vivid blood red that stands out dramatically against the rest of the creature's coloration. They can't sustain the Zilant in true flight. What they are good for is gliding, so crossing a ravine, dropping from the crown of a burial mound into something below, slowing a descent through a cave shaft. They also make for an extremely effective and highly memorable threat display, rising up suddenly from the tall steppe grass or rearing back with a deep rumbling growl as those blood-red wings snap out around the head like the flaring hood of a massive cobra from the very depths of hell. Once you've seen a Zilant do this, you do not forget it, and neither will your players. The body itself is a deep, sheening, almost iridescent black, oily in texture, consistently so across all of the varieties of the creature. The steppe dwellers and the mountain hunters alike. That oiliness matters, as we will discuss shortly. The neck is long and sinuous, and the head is wedge-shaped, narrow and arrow-pointed. Not a skull built for crushing, but for speed and precision. The Zilant bites like a viper, fast, accurate, there to inject rather than to clamp and hold. Along the spine, most individuals carry a crest of elongated scales running from the crown down the back of the neck, and some depictions from Reshemi and Mergomi artists' traditions show this as an actual feathered crest, distinct from the bare membranous red of the wings. Once you know what you're looking at, the Zilant is immediately recognizable, immediately unlike anything in the standard Draconic lineup. If you remember only one thing about the Zilant though, it should be this. Everything about it is poisonous. That toxicity is layered in ways that make fighting it a genuinely complicated tactical problem. Its primary attack is a wide, pressurized spray of highly concentrated venom that fans out and coats everything in its arc, drenching targets rather than cutting through them, working through the skin and the eyes and the mucous membranes on contact. The oily coating of those glossy black scales is part of how it delivers this. The Zilant doesn't necessarily need to bite you to poison you. In practice, it really does. The clawed forelimbs are for pinning and controlling, the long striking neck for a precise bite when needed, but the spray is the opener, and the spray is usually enough. Strike it hard enough to draw blood, however, and you have just introduced a second problem, because the blood is as toxic as the venom that it spatters. This has profound tactical implications for experienced hunters of the creature who've learned through painful trial and error. Hacking at a Zilant with a sword is a strategy that tends to poison the person doing the hacking. Warriors who have fought Zilants and survived generally do so at range, or report being extraordinarily careful about where their blows land and how they've managed to manage the inevitable splash. The preferred weapon among those who have given this serious thought is a spear at maximum extension or a bow from a considerable distance. And then there's the corpse. The dead Zilant does not become safe. The body continues to off-gas toxins as it decomposes, the oily coating breaking down into the surrounding soil and air for days afterward. And old Zilant kill sites are sometimes identifiable by what's not there. It's a bare, scorched-looking patch in the steppe grass where the soil remains toxic long after the bones have scattered and nothing has grown back. The Reshemi word for this persistent death zone is Vethkural, roughly translated as the still biting place, and the Horse Lord's traditions is simply to leave a slain Zilant exactly where it fell, mark the site with a warning stick, and give it a wide berth for at least a week. This pervasive layered toxicity goes a long way toward explaining why the Zilant became so thoroughly associated with graves and burial grounds in the cultures that know it. Its presence creates a kind of sacred uncleanness around it. Graves guarded by Zilants are not merely spiritually protected, they are physically dangerous to approach, and most who understand what a Zilant is will never try it. As to where the Zilant fits in the Draconic family tree, the Zilant is a true dragon, not a drake or a dragonkin or a wyvern, but a full member of the Draconic family that represents an early branching of the lineage, one that diverged before the great split between the chromatic and metallic worms that dominate Faerunian scholarship. The sages of Candlekeep have been arguing about this for some time, and I find the argument genuinely compelling. The Zilant's body plan, 2 forelimbs, no hind legs, serpentine lower body, limited wings, is not a deformity or an aberration. Look at the creatures that share elements of it. The Wyrm is in the classic sense, is a near legless draconic serpent. The Wyvern, with its 2-limbed arrangement of wings where arms should be, and the Lindworm or Linorm of Northern legend, which is like the Zilant, has because it's got 4 limbs and no hind legs. These are not coincidences. These are branches from the same early trunk of the tree, and the Zilant may well be closer to that trunk than the great chromatic dragons are. In this view, these magnificently terrifying creatures are the Zilant's distant descendants rather than its superiors. The Reshemi Hathrans have a version of this belief in that they think is the most elegant framing of the whole question. In their cosmology, the Zilant is first among snakes and first among dragons. the bridge creature, the form that contains within it the ancestral potential of the entire draconic order. It's not a lesser thing, it's the original thing. And there are two breeds of Zilant that I know of. The steppe Zilant, also known as the tomb dweller. On the open horselands, the Zilant finds its preferred home in the great burial mounds of the horse clan chieftains. These earthen tumuli rise over the honoured dead, ringed with standing stones hauled from distant quarries and carved with name marks and symbols of the horse lords that they say are older than language. Spirals and chevrons and angular running horses. The mound is sealed, the stones are set so that the site can be seen for miles across the flat land, and the dead lie inside with their burial goods and their legend carved into the rock around them. Then the Zilant moves in. It enlarges the entrance just enough to accommodate its sinuous lower body, installs itself in the burial chamber inside alongside the dead, and there it stays. It's not a temporary denning. The steppe Zilant is an established mound lair that may remain for decades, developing a territory investment in that site that intensifies with every passing year. And it does not need to range far to feed. The mound lair, sanctified by death power and protected by the creature's toxic reputation, draws things to it. Scavengers, the curious, outcast, the foolish, the spiritually compelled, fanatics. Because this land is above all things an ambush predator, and the mound lair is an almost perfect ambush environment, its glossy black coloration vanishes into the shadow inside the tunnel. Outside, in the tall grass that grows thick around the standing stones, it can coil motionless for extraordinary long periods of time, and there's simply nothing to see, nothing to hear, until there is a flash of red wings and a strike from a direction nobody was watching. The Horse Lords say that a mound-dwelling Zilant accumulates minions over time, not through any deliberate recruitment, but through the way its territorial claim reshapes the behaviour of local creatures and sometimes local people. The wolves tend to den near Zilant mounds, drawn by kills the dragon abandons. Outcast humans sometimes make offerings and receive the creature's tolerance in exchange for serving as early warning scouts. There are darker stories of cults forming around particularly old and powerful steppe Zilants. Communities that have developed over generations into something that blurs the line between veneration and servitude rather uncomfortably. The steppe Zilant is a well-established lair, is not a wandering threat. It sits at the centre of something that has been growing around it for years, sometimes decades, and by the time anyone has fought their way through whatever surrounds it, the wolves, the cultists, the desperate and the devoted, they arrive at the dead and toxic burial mound itself, only to realise that every brutal encounter they just survived was the creature's outermost defences, and the thing that made all those lesser dangers possible is still waiting for them inside. And then there is the mountain Zilant, the cave hunter. The variant found in the hill country bordering Rashomon and Murgome is a harder creature. Its scales are thicker, rougher, less iridescent, the glossy black shading towards a duller charcoal and iron grey in the mountain form, though the red wings and wedge skull remain absolutely consistent. You would know this for what it was if you saw it in time. The mountain Zilant lairs in natural cave systems rather than constructed tombs, and its relationships to the dead is less ceremonial than its step cousin. It is attracted to cliff-face burial niches and ancient dolmen fields where they occur in its territory. It does not dwell in them with the devotional commitment of the steppe variant. What it lacks in spiritual gravitas, it compensates for an aggressive, active predation. It hunts using the serpentine lower body to move through broken terrain with unsettling speed, and using cave and rock formations to cover the way the steppe Zilant uses tall grass and mound shadows. Travellers in the hill country who report narrow escapes tend to describe the experience in similar terms. The first sign of the Zilant is a sound, a dry scrape of scale on stone from a direction they weren't watching, and then it's already among them. The mountain Zilant is, in simple terms, what the steppe Zilant would become if you removed the grave mound from the equation and replaced it with just pure hunger. On One other distinction sets the Mountain Zilant apart from its step cousin, and it is one that anyone travelling the Highland Passes should be aware of. The Mountain Zilant and the Mountain Giants of the Copper Ranges are ancient enemies, a rivalry that predates any human or draconic presence in the region by a considerable margin. The Zilant hunts giants with a focused, almost personal intensity that goes well beyond simple predation, and a Mountain Zilant's lair will invariably contain the skulls of giants it has killed, cleaned, and kept, sometimes dozens of them, arranged with a deliberateness that suggests something closer to pride than instinct. A giant skull outside a cave entrance in the Copper Mountains is not a warning left for other giants, it is a trophy, and the creature that put it there is still inside. In Murgome, the mountain variant is called the Zilant Temir, the Iron Zilant, and among the dragon princes who rule there today, it is regarded with a disgust and unease that goes well beyond the usual draconic territorial instinct. The princes came down out of the Copper Mountains in the wake of a plague in 1409 Ale Reckoning, having watched kin and rivals alike sicken and die in those same highland passes where the Zilant Temir makes its home. Whether the creature had any hand in what happened there is a question nobody has seriously investigated, because the dragon princes do not want it investigated. They want the Zilant Temir treated as the unclean, toxic, ill-omened thing that their instincts tell them it is, and the Murgome subjects have learned not to argue the point. A Zilant Temir sighted in the lowlands is reported to the nearest dragon prince's court immediately, and the response is never casual. These are creatures that even dragons regard as a bad omen, which, when you consider what dragons actually are, should tell you something. For the Zilant and the Horse Lords, the Horse Clan peoples of the Hordelands do not worship the Zilant. They do not hunt it either. The relationship is better described as a wary coexistence structured by reciprocal obligation, which, if you have spent any time reading about steppe cultures, is a very familiar kind of arrangement. When a great chieftain is buried, the mound raised and the stone set, the name marks carved, and a Zilant subsequently takes up residence, the Horse Lord read this as a sign of the chieftain's spiritual magnitude. Only the great attract a Zilant, only those whose death echo is strong enough to be felt by a creature that apparently feeds on those resonances, and to have one in their ancestral mound is an honour that reflects on living descendants. It says, in terms that require no translation, that someone important is in there. In entirely practical terms, the Zilant's territorial nature and its toxic reputation mean that the burial site is now physically defended against grave robbers and desecrating armies, which are a constant threat on the steppes. In exchange, the clan leaves offerings at the standing stones, dried meat, carved horse figurines, occasionally something much more significant and horrific, and the Zilant tolerates their periodic ritual visits. It is, genuinely, a working arrangement. Both parties get something out of it. The shamans, however, hold a more troubling interpretation alongside the honorific one, and I think this is the more interesting one of the two. They say that the Zilant dwelling with the dead long enough begins to absorb them, that the spiritual residue of the ancestor seeps into the creature over years and decades, and that an old Zilant is no longer entirely itself. In their telling, it carries memories that are not its own, and may look at the descendants of the chieftain it has lived beside and see them through the dead man's eyes as well as its own. Whether this is ancient wisdom, superstition, or simply the stories of people who themselves try to make sense of something deeply unsettling, no sage has ever been in a position to verify it and lived to publish the results. What is certain is that shamans approach mound-dwelling Zilants with extraordinary care, and the Zilant, intelligent, patient, and entirely capable of holding a conversation in Draconic if it chooses, does nothing to discourage this belief. Now, in Rashomon and Murgome, the Hathrans, which is the witch leaders of Rashomon, classify the Zilant differently from Faerunian draconologists, which will surprise nobody who has ever dealt with Rashimi Hathrans. For the witches, the Zilant is not merely a predator with an affinity for burial sites, nor a creature drawn to the spiritual residue of the dead. It is death given physical form, a literal manifestation of that force, ancient and patient and entirely indifferent to the opinions of the living. They are not particularly interested in outside opinions on the matter, and since they are usually the most dangerous people in the room, I strongly advise you keep your opinions about their beliefs to yourself. What Rashimi witch traditions does preserve, in considerable detail, is the practice of Zilant speaking, a ritual approach to a tomb-dwelling Zilant using specific offerings and spiritual songs. The Zilant is an intelligent creature that speaks Draconic, and if the ritual is performed correctly, it will answer the questions put to it, drawing on whatever knowledge death itself has to offer. The catch, and it is a rather significant one, is that the ritual is not a negotiation, it is a sacrifice. Performed correctly, this signals to the Zilant that the witch has offered her life in exchange for the knowledge she seeks, and the Zilant will collect that debt at a time of its own choosing. The witch goes home, she lives perhaps for months, perhaps for years, and then the Zilant comes for her, and she must allow it. If she runs, if she fights, if anyone attempts to intervene on her behalf, the Zilant interprets this as a betrayal of the bargain, and its retribution falls not on her alone, but on her entire people. And this is why apprentice witches do not attempt Zilant speaking. Not only do they have their whole lives to live, and many years of service to their people would be wasted, but the Zilant would certainly see them as unworthy offerings, refuse to impart its knowledge, and simply kill them anyway, without holding up its end of the bargain. A Hathran who seeks out the Zilant has lived a full life of service, has wisdom and power enough to be considered a worthy sacrifice, and has questions so important that she is willing to pay the ultimate price for the answer. Those who have done so are not spoken of lightly. Now, on to running the Zilant at your table. Here is the part I suspect you came for, and the good news is that you do not need to build a new stat block from scratch. The existing Black Dragon does most of the work for you, because the Black Dragon is already an ambush predator with a sinuous physical profile and affinity for ruin and decay, and a damage type that needs only modest translation. Acid becomes poison. Replace the Black Dragon's acid line with a venom spray. Keep the damage profile and recharge mechanic exactly as they are, but changing the shape from a line to a cone or wide arc to reflect the drenching, saturating quality of the Zilant's attack. Venom replaces acid throughout the stat block, and that single change ripples through the whole encounter in interesting ways, since poison resistance and immunity are distributed very differently among player character builds than acid resistance is. Blood toxin, so whenever the Zilant takes piercing or slashing damage from a melee attack, the attacker and all creatures adjacent to the Zilant make a constitution saving throw or take poison damage, half on a success. This one addition fundamentally transforms how players engage with the fight. The instinct to hack at it with a sword becomes the an act of calculated self-harm, and suddenly everyone at the table is thinking about range and positioning and whether the barbarian's enthusiasm is about to get the whole party poisoned. This is exactly the tactical tension you want from this creature, particularly in tight confines. The corpse becomes a hazard. When the Zilant dies, creatures starting their turns within 10 feet of the body make a constitution save or take poison damage, and this persists for a number of days appropriate to the creature's age category. Mark the spot on the map. Make the players decide in the moment how badly they want the loot and what they're willing to do while they wait for the body to become safe. A dragon that is still costing the party resources even after it's dead is doing something most monsters never manage. And of course, while it's lying there dead and the rumours spread that the lair is now unguarded and you've got an open tomb with a chieftain's wealth, well, that poses all sorts of problems. Movement, so you replace the Black Dragon's fly speed with a glide ability. The Zilant can move horizontally up to 4 times the height it falls from and takes no damage when gliding, increasing its burrow speed to reflect the serpentine lower body and its comfort in tight underground spaces. The swim speed stays the same. The build suits water movement naturally, but sustained flight goes because canonically it just can't. For spellcasting, the Zilant has no reputation in the source folklore as a sorcerer or arcane practitioner. Retain the draconic presence, the frightful presence, the legendary resistances, lair action scales to tomb environments rather than swamps, but trim the spell list down to or remove it entirely. If you want an at-will ability, something tied to a death sense or a supernatural awareness of the dead in its lair, fit the creature far better than elemental magic. The Zilant's power is physical and chemical and spiritual, and it should feel that way at the table. The serpentine lower body means the Zilant occupies space differently than a standard dragon, as it is worth giving it the ability to squeeze through spaces appropriate for a creature one size smaller than it is without penalty. It is specifically adapted to tomb, tunnels, and cave passages, and that should be reflected mechanically rather than just described in flavor text. For everything else, its hit points, armor class by age category, legendary actions, they stay exactly as the Black Dragon provides it. The lair action set may want adjusting for underground tomb environments rather than swamps, but the mechanical framework is sound and has been field tested across decades of play, so if it ain't broke, don't fix it. One thing the stat block will not remind you of, but which changes every encounter significantly, is the Zilant is highly intelligent and speaks Draconic. It's not a mindless predator that attacks on sight. It is an ancient evil creature that thinks, plans, and negotiates entirely on its own terms, and it knows exactly how dangerous it is, which means it also knows when talking serves it better than fighting. A Zilant that allows a party to approach its mound without immediately attacking is not being friendly. It's made a calculation, and whatever conclusion it has reached is not going to be in the party's favor, believe me. So play it accordingly. The result is a creature that feels genuinely different at the table, an ambush predator that punishes melee engagement, that becomes more dangerous in enclosed spaces than in the open, and that lingers as a threat even after it's dead. And players who have fought Black Dragons before will find the Zilant familiar enough to engage with confidently and surprising enough to actually respect. Finally, some adventure hooks for you. The Honor Guard, the clan's most sacred war banner, was interred with a great chieftain 3 generations ago, and a Zilant has dwelt in the mound ever since. With a major conflict approaching, the clan needs that banner, but the shaman refuses to sanction disturbing the creature, and the creature has made it clear in perfectly fluent Draconic that anyone who enters the mound uninvited will not leave. The players must find a way to negotiate with something ancient, intelligent, evil, and entirely comfortable with its position. And whatever the Zilant reveals about what is actually in that mound may make them wish they had never asked. The Still Biting Place. A Zilant has been killed, but by what? The Veth corral around the mound is keeping the locals well back, and something about the wound patterns on the kill site does not match any predator or hunter the Horse Lords can identify. The players are hired to investigate what without getting poisoned. The answer involves something else that has been using the steppe burial mounds as a resource, something considerably more patient than any Zilant, and rather annoyed that its arrangements have been disrupted. The price already paid. An elderly Hathran has performed Zilant speaking and received her answer, and now she needs the players to understand one thing very clearly. They are not to interfere with what is coming. She will not tell them when. She will not tell them which Zilant. She will only tell them that if they attempt to protect her, the consequences will fall on the people who deserve none of it. The adventure is not about saving her, it's about what she learned, why it was worth dying for, and what the players choose to do with that knowledge before the Zilant arrives to collect its payment. The Iron Prince's problem. One of Murgom's dragon princes had received reports of the Zilant Temir moving through its lowland territory, and his reaction has been far beyond what the situation seems to warrant. Patrols doubled, villagers warned, and almost panicked urgency that his courtiers have never seen from him before. He is hiring outsiders rather than using his own forces, which tells the players something important. He does not want his own people to know what he is actually afraid of. Whether the Zilant Temir is connected to the plague of 1409 in ways that the dragon has never shared with anyone, or whether it's simply that after all these centuries something has finally found a way to make a dragon prince frightened, is a question worth investigating carefully. For those of you who arrived at the end of this video, let me make it very clear that the Zilant, while a real mythological monster, has never appeared in Dungeons & Dragons. This is my own addition to the Forgotten Realms lore, based on the existing lore as I know it. So, something new for you in the spirit of the game and the living lore of the realms. The Zilant, an ambush predator of the steppes and the burial mounds, glossy black and red-winged, and poisonous in ways that will ruin a fighter's whole day. Ancestral to Wyrms and Wyverns and Lenorms, older than the chromatic lineage, if you believe the Hathrans, drawn to the graves of the great and the accumulated spiritual weight of the honoured dead. Present in human folklore for centuries, waiting patiently in the tall grass to be installed smoothly into a fantasy landscape that has always had room for it. Enjoy, and let your traumatized players know I said hi. My name is AJ Pickett, your sage of Candlekeep, the Deckard Cain of D&D, expert in imaginary and master of monsters. As always, thanks for listening, and I'll be back with more for you very soon.